Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Steven Kitchell. Today, we're going to be going over the trumpet blast. And this is showing that Baha'u'llah in the Baha'i faith is the return of Christ. For part one, we're going to be going over trumpet blast 1 through 4. This is going to be Roman history. In part two, we're going to be going over trumpet blast 5 and the first woe of the book of Revelation. And this is going to coincide with Islamic history. So we're going to get started off today with my video. The song is You Raise Me Up with my All right, so for today, we're going to be going over the first 5 trumpet blasts. Part 1, we're going over the first 4. So what we're going to do is we're going to read the first 4 trumpet blasts, then we're going to do a verse-by-verse breakdown. Revelation chapter 8, verses 7 through 12 says, "The first angel sounded his trumpet, and there came hail and fire mixed with blood, and it was hurled down upon the earth. A third of the earth was burned up, a third of the trees were burned up, all the green grass was burned up. The second angel sounded his trumpet, and something like a huge mountain, all ablaze, was thrown into the sea. A third of the sea turned into blood, a third of the living creatures in the sea died, and a third of the ships were destroyed. The third angel sounded his trumpet, and a great star, blazing like a torch, fell from the sky on a third of the rivers and on the springs of water. The name of the star is Wormwood. A third of the waters turned bitter, and many people died from the waters that had become bitter. The fourth angel sounded his trumpet, and a third of the sun was struck, a third of the moon, and a third of the stars, so that a third of them turned dark. A third of the day was without light, and also a third of the night." Remember from the last presentation, biblical prophecy is written symbolically, not literally. So we're going to be going over what these symbols mean, and we're going to be lining them up with historical events. So for the first trumpet blast, the first angel sounded his trumpet, and there came hail and fire mixed with blood, and it was hurled down upon the earth. A third of the earth was burned up, a third of the trees were burned up, and all the green grass is burned up. So let's go over what the trees mean and the grass mean. In Psalm 92, it says, "The righteous shall flourish like a palm tree. They will grow like a cedar of Lebanon." So trees and grass symbolize something that is righteous. In Revelation 22, it says, "Down the middle of the great street of the city, on each side of the river, stood the tree of life, bearing 12 crops of fruit, yielding its fruit every month. And the leaves of the tree are for the healing of nations." So again, the grass and trees symbolize that as something righteous. And so something righteous is being destroyed because there's hail and fire mixed with blood coming down. So this is not a biblical prophecy for global warming. No, this is the righteous being persecuted is what this is. And if you remember from last week, in the Roman Empire, the persecution of the Christians began under Nero, when Nero decided that he was going to burn Rome down. That was the first wave of persecution of the Christians. But that was not the only wave of the persecution that went out. Many other Roman emperors, like Marcus Aurelius, Maximus I, they also persecuted the Christians heavily. And the persecution of the Christians would go on and off until year 311 AD. And we're going to see a little bit why it stopped in year 311 AD. But the first trumpet blast is the persecution of the Christians. Now we're coming down to the second trumpet blast. The second angel sounded his trumpet, and something like a huge mountain all ablaze was thrown into the sea. A third of the sea turned into blood, a third of the living creatures in the sea died, and a third of the ships were destroyed. So let's get into what the symbolism of the mountain is. Jesus replied, "Truly, I tell you, if you have faith and do not doubt, not only can you do what is done to the fig tree, but also you can say to this mountain, go throw yourself into the sea, and it will be done." So a mountain symbolizes some sort of large obstacle or something, an immovable object. It's not literally a mountain, because remember, biblical prophecy is written symbolically, not literally. So we see like a huge obstacle or an immovable object turning him ablaze, being thrown into the sea, and many people die because of it. In the book, in Revelation 17, it says, "Then the angel said to me, the waters you saw where the prostitute sits are peoples, multitudes, nations, and languages." So we're looking at some sort of civil war here. And this is what we see in the Christ of the 3rd century AD. Now we're going to watch a 10-minute clip here, because when I was doing research to do a presentation, I saw this clip, and I realized that this clip can explain things much better than I ever could. So sometimes in life, you just have to know where your limitations are at and know that someone else can do something better than you sometimes. And so we're going to watch this 10-minute clip for the second trumpet blast. Then we'll jump over to the third trumpet blast. And this is going to be the only time in all my presentations I do this. So.
Throughout its existence, the Roman state lived through many periods of troubles, but none of them were as dangerous as the crisis of the 3rd century. The empire was being torn to pieces by internal strife, and enemies from all sides were eager to steal its lands. In this video, we are going to talk about the crisis of the 3rd century, how it occurred, what happened, and the aftermath. After a series of civil wars that shook the foundations of the Republic, in 31 BC, Gaius Octavian defeated Mark Antony at the Battle of Actium and became the first emperor of Rome. Although we call him the emperor, his real title was princeps, which means the first citizen, and a quasi-republican rule continued. The empire was living in relative peace until in 68 AD, a coup forced Nero to commit suicide. This resulted in a crisis that was later called the Year of the Four Emperors, and in the summer of 69, Vespasian became the emperor and established the Flavian dynasty. 3 representatives of this family and 5 members of the Nerva-Antonine dynasty, collectively known as the 5 Good Emperors, ruled during the following period of stability. During the rule of Emperor Trajan, the empire reached its greatest extent territorially. His heir, Hadrian, decided to stop the expansion and built a number of defensive fortifications. The next emperor, Marcus Aurelius, had to fight a prolonged conflict called the Marcomannic Wars against the barbarian tribes, but despite this, his reign is considered to be a golden age for Rome. His son, Commodus, started his rule well, but later on his paranoia led to his assassination, and in 192, the Year of the 5 Emperors began. The winner of the ensuing struggle for power was Septimus Severus. His Severan dynasty ruled for the next 4 decades, providing 7 emperors. This time was marked with an increase in the size of the military. The regular army was doubled in size and had been promised 50% higher pay. The Severan emperors had to decrease the percentage of silver in their coins to be able to pay for this bigger army, and that started a protracted economic crisis. The role of the military increased tenfold, while the Senate lost its privileges. In 232, the last Severan emperor, Alexander Severus, had to fight against the newly formed Sassanid Empire, which had toppled the Parthians. We know very little about this war against Ardashir I, but it seems that despite some setbacks, the territories of the empire were preserved. However, casualties had been very high, and the military had become insubordinate, especially towards Alexander. When he seemed reluctant to fight against Germanic invaders in 235, he was murdered by his own legionaries. Thus started the crisis of the 3rd century. The monetary crisis ramped up, and the army became the only real source of power. Around 30 so-called barrack emperors or soldier emperors were crowned in the next 50 years. At the same time, the empire was facing a greater number of foreign enemies than ever before. The Goths, Vandals, and Alemanni started raiding provinces along the Rhine-Danube frontiers, while to the east, the Sassanid Empire was eager to exploit Roman weakness to take control over the Levant. In 252, Shapur I seized Nisibis, and during the next year defeated the Roman army sent to the area at Barbarissos and conquered Antioch. Emperor Valerian had to march against the Sassanids to keep the eastern territories intact, while his son Gallienus was left in charge of the west. Valerian's troops arrived in Asia Minor in 259, but at that moment, Gothic tribes invaded the region. Sources do not provide any information on the ensuing battles, and it is possible that the Goths rampaged through Asia Minor and then returned beyond the Danube. Valerian continued his march towards Edessa, which was under siege by Shapur I. Once again, we don't know the details, but Valerian's 70,000 strong army was utterly defeated by the 40,000 soldiers of Shapur. Valerian became the first Roman emperor to be captured in battle. He passed away a year later. His son Gallienus claimed the throne, but he had to quell a rebellion against his rule in 260. At the same time, the Alemanni and other Germanic tribes invaded northern Italy. The emperor was forced to march back to stop them. His troops intercepted the enemy near Mediolanum. It is said that Gallienus only had 60,000 troops against the 300,000 barbarians, but his cavalry won the day. However, rebellions against him continued, and in 260, Roman commander Postumus declared his independence and formed what was later called the Gallic Empire in Gaul and Britannia. He used the fact that Gallienus was off fighting other usurpers to also take control of Hispania. Thankfully for the Romans, their eastern provinces were saved from the Sassanid invasion by a noble from the city of Palmyra called Odenathus, whose sources claim was the governor of Syria during the Battle of Edessa. He defeated a number of local usurpers and was able to pacify the Roman East. In 262 and 263, Odenathus took back all the lands lost to the Sassanids and even reached their capital, Ctesiphon. Odenathus then declared himself the King of Kings, thus challenging the Sassanids' legitimacy while remaining a Roman vassal. Details are obscure once again, but we know that in 267, Odenathus was assassinated in Anatolia and his widow Zenobia became the regent of their son. Meanwhile, to the west, Postumus managed to defend his new realm against Gallienus in 265 and 266. This probably caused discontent among the legions of the Roman emperor, and in 268 he was assassinated and Claudius II took the throne. Claudius needed to regain the Gallic provinces, but a Gothic incursion into modern-day Serbia forced him to move against them instead. In 269, he defeated the invaders at Nisus. Sources assert that more than 50,000 Goths were killed, and that was the reason why they were only able to attack Rome a century later. Claudius also managed to stop another Alemanni raid at the Battle of Lake Benacus in 269. In the same year, Postumus was killed and was succeeded by Marius. Claudius exploited the Gallic Empire's weakness and took Hispania back. However, he wasn't able to conclude the reconquest as he succumbed to a plague in 270. Aurelian became the emperor shortly after. In the east, Zenobia decided to take advantage of Claudius's death and declare her son the emperor. By 271, Egypt and most of central and eastern Anatolia became part of the Palmyran Empire. Aurelian was under pressure from all sides. He started by expelling the Vandals from northern Italy, and then defeated another Alemanni incursion at the battles of Fano and Pavia. At the same time, he decided to abandon the province of Dacia, as it was exposed to attack, being beyond the Danube. The Palmyran conquest of Egypt created a grain crisis in Rome. Aurelian needed to deal with Zenobia, so in 272 he marched to the east. In less than a year, Palmyran forces were defeated, and the eastern part of the empire was reconquered. Some sources claim that part of the Library of Alexandria was burnt during this campaign. Aurelian then returned to the west. Initially, he attempted to use diplomacy to reclaim the Gallic Empire. This failed, and in 274 he attacked them and won the Battle of Chalons. This once again brought Gaul and Britannia under Roman control. Although the Roman Empire was reunited, the death of Aurelian in 275 started a new round of the crisis. 6 emperors came to power in the next 9 years, until Diocletian defeated all opposition and became the empire's ruler in 284. Diocletian's reign is considered to be the end of the crisis of the 3rd century. Although it was as full of warfare and violence as the previous 5 decades, Diocletian managed to stabilize the empire with his reforms. A general census was conducted that helped with taxation. The emperor also attempted to enact an edict setting maximum prices, but it backfired as the black market effectively took over. His most important reform was the creation of the tetrarchy. The empire was divided into the eastern and western halves. Each got an emperor, Augustus, and both emperors appointed their heirs, Caesars. The goal was to create a stable inheritance system. Despite the fact that the tetrarchy failed shortly after the death of Diocletian, the Western and Eastern Roman empires became the standard division, and that prolonged the existence of the Roman Empire. Thank you for watching our documentary on the crisis of the 3rd century. We would like to express our gratitude to our Patreon supporters who make the creation of these videos possible. The video was narrated by me, officially Devin. Don't forget to stop by my channel for my narrative Let's Plays. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.
All right, so just to recap, that make sure we're all going forward on the same page. Well, the second trumpet blast, Revelation 8, verse 8 says, the second angel sounded his trumpet, and something like a huge mountain, all ablaze, was thrown into the sea. A third of the sea turned into blood, a third of the living creatures in the sea died, and a third of the ships were destroyed. That was the crisis of the 3rd century AD in the Roman Empire. So, first trumpet blast is Christian persecution. Second trumpet blast is the crisis of the 3rd century. So, let's move on to the third trumpet blast. The third angel sounded his trumpet, and a great star, blazing like a torch, fell from the sky on a third of the rivers and on the springs of water. The name of the star is wormwood. A third of the waters turned bitter, and many people died from the waters that had become bitter. Now, just to recap, the waters, Revelation 17 says, then the angel said to me, the waters you saw where the prostitute sits are peoples, multitudes, nations, and languages. And then behold, it tells us what the stars symbolize. He says in the book of certitude, thus it has become evident that the sun, moon, and stars primarily signify the prophets of God, the saints, and their companions, those luminaries, the light of whose knowledge has shed illumination upon the worlds of the visible and invisible. Remember, in the Baha'i faith, we claim that Baha'u'llah is the return of Christ. So let's go back up to the third trumpet blast. We see a great star, blazing like a torch falling from the sky onto the rivers and springs of water. So we see someone of God coming in much of the people. And the name of the star is wormwood. Wormwood means something that is bitter. So we got something of God coming in, bringing the word of God to the people, but it's bitter in how it's being done. And a third of the waters turned bitter, and many people died from the waters that had become bitter. So because it's bitter, it causes a lot of conflict. So what we're looking here is the Emperor Constantine, because it's Emperor Constantine who made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. Emperor Constantine, he was born in the year 272 AD. Emperor Constantine was introduced to Christianity through his mother, because she was a Christian. Now, it is disputed as to exactly when Emperor Constantine became Christian, but it is widely believed in year 312 AD. One thing in the Baha'i faith, we heavily stress the education of women, because Abdu'l-Baha, remember, he's the Paul equivalent, he says, it is therefore clear that the education of girls is a far greater consequence than that of boys. This fact is extremely important, and the matter must be seen with the greatest energy and dedication. Because we say it's very important, because it's the women who teach the children. And we see this with Emperor Constantine. He was introduced to Christianity through his mother, and he's the one who brought Christianity to the Roman Empire. So that's why we say the education of women is of such great importance in the Baha'i faith. Now, how exactly he became Christian? Now, there are several versions out there about how he converted to Christianity, but I'm going to give you the most widely accepted version, because he claims that he had a vision before the Battle of Milvian Bridge on 12 October in year 312 AD. And in this dream, God told Constantine to inscribe the sign of God on his soldier shields. And the sign that was used right here was this right here. It's called the Chi symbol, because this is the symbol for Jesus Christ in the Greek language. Now, because like in Christianity, you have multiple symbols for Christianity. The most widely used is the cross. And then you also have the Chi symbol, and that's where this symbol began. But the symbol also has a dual meaning to it, because on one hand, it is the symbols for Jesus Christ in the Greek language, but it also has a lot of Roman Mithraism to it, so it has a pagan background to it. So it was both acceptable to both the Christians and the pagans of the time. And so what he did is he began to devise a special standard, the labarum, which is displayed on the Christogram. And right here is the labarum that was displayed on. This is one of the Roman allegiance symbols. So you have the symbol for Jesus Christ on top of the Roman symbol for allegiance and the symbol for power. At the time, it was a very strong symbolism to it. And at the Battle of Milvian Bridge, Constantine won a decisive victory, and this was done in the name of Christ. So after this battle is when Emperor Constantine became Christian. But during this time, they're also coming out of the crisis of the 3rd century AD, as we just watched that video for. So the Romans were in a civil war. The tetrarchy that was put in place, it was still there. Constantine was one of the rulers of the tetrarchy. The other three were Maximian, Maxentius, and Licinius. Maximian, he committed suicide after a failed assassination attempt at Emperor Constantine in year 311 AD. Because Maximian, he wanted to have Constantine assassinated, but Constantine found out what was going on. So when the assassin went into Emperor Constantine's room at night to have him assassinated, Constantine had himself replaced with a eunuch. So it wasn't Constantine that was assassinated, it was the eunuch that was assassinated. And so once it came out what Maximian wanted, Maximian committed suicide. So the first Roman emperor in the tetrarchy is down. Then we come to year 312 AD. This is the Battle of Milvian Bridge, when Maxentius was defeated. Because Maxentius and Constantine both claimed that they were ruling the Western Roman Empire, which you can't have two emperors making the same claim. So they fought, and this is when Constantine defeated him at the Battle of Milvian Bridge. And this is after Constantine converted to Christianity. And so we're down to two emperors. You have Constantine left and you have Licinius. Constantine controlled West Rome, Licinius controlled East Rome. But Licinius was defeated in year 324 AD, making Emperor Constantine the sole emperor of the Roman Empire. And is after he became emperor of the Roman Empire is when he brought Christianity to the Roman Empire. Now, bringing Christianity to the Roman Empire was a pretty enormous problem back then, because being Christian meant that your loyalty to the pagan state could be questioned. Because remember, Rome, they had their pagan gods, a lot of paganism in there. Paganism was tied into the state, and the state was tied into loyalty to the empire, into the emperor. So if you're Christian, that meant that you could be questioned. Like, hey, is this guy, is he loyal to the empire? We might have to watch out for this guy. Plus, the Christians had their own bishops, and the pagans had their own clergy, and the bishops were often accused of fostering disunity to the empire. So many times what would happen, especially in the Roman military, the Christians, they'd be forced to conduct pagan sacrifices, or they were forced to leave the army. That way they were demonstrating their loyalty to the empire. Because remember, Rome was in this massive civil war. So they didn't want people getting into the military if their loyalty could be questioned. So by conducting pagan sacrifices, they were demonstrating their loyalty to the empire and to the emperor. However, this is beginning to become different because the emperor was now Christian. The emperor was no longer pagan. But even though the emperor was Christian, he couldn't just force Christianity down the Roman Empire, because the Roman Empire was mostly pagan. This went from the general public to the Senate and even to the Roman military. So he knew he had to move cautiously, incrementally bringing Christianity into the Roman Empire. Because if you push it too fast, he could be overthrown, and then Rome's right back in the middle of another civil war, and Christians would take the blame for it, and they'd be heavily persecuted. So he knew he couldn't just rein it in there. So what he decided to do is he decided he's going to begin putting incremental reforms in there. And one of the things he did is he didn't celebrate the secular games, and this caused offense in multiple years. Because normally what would happen is the Roman emperor, he would send to the steps of the Capitol and sacrifice to Jupiter, one of the pagan gods. Emperor Constantine was no longer doing that because he was Christian. However, one thing he did do is he did retain the imperial cult. Because in the one thing Rome did is they elevated their emperors up to godhood status. And so he wanted to retain the imperial cult, because if he got rid of that, then that means the Roman citizens could begin questioning the emperor, and that would cause, basically he'd be risking another civil war in the Roman Empire, which he didn't want to do. So he did retain the imperial cult. However, by the end of his life, there were virtually no pagan sacrifices being conducted, because he began incrementally getting rid of the pagan sacrifices. Another thing he did is he began drawing a lot of parallels between Roman paganism and Christianity. Because in Roman paganism, soul he's the personification of the sun. He's the sun god. And what he did is he drew a parallel. He took the verse in Malachi 4, verse 2. It says, "But for you who revere my name, the Son of Righteousness will rise with healing in its rays, and you will go out and frolic like well-fed calves." He took this phrase here, the Son of Righteousness, and that's how he began drawing parallels between the Roman sun god and Christianity. Like one thing Christ was referred to during this time in Rome was Sol Justifii, the son of justice. Another thing they do is because Sol, the Roman sun god, he was often portrayed in a chariot driving across the heavens. Well, they also began portraying Christ in the same way, and they also began creating statues of Christ resembling Sol, the Roman sun god, or Apollo, the Greek sun god, because he wanted to start portraying Christianity in a way that the pagans understood, because he was creating double meanings here. So on one hand, the Christians found it acceptable, and on the other hand, the pagans also found it acceptable. Another thing they started referring to Christ as Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun. And that's crowns the Christian standard, the labarum, because this Chi-Rho symbol here, this is the Christian standard right here, and we've already gone over where that symbolism came from. And right here was the labarum. You also had the symbols of the sun on there. So you had Christ, the symbol of Jesus Christ in Greek, the Chi-Rho symbol, overpowering the Roman military, the Roman power, and the sun. So it was back then, it was a very powerful symbolism that Emperor Constantine was using because he's creating dual meanings. The Christians found it acceptable because this is Jesus Christ, and the pagans found it acceptable because it's the sun god. And so both sides were happy. And this is how he begins to incrementally get Christianity into the Roman Empire. And here's why Christians go to church on Sunday. Emperor Constantine decreed in 321 AD, all magistrates, city dwellers, and artisans are to rest on the venerable day of the sun, though country dwellers may without hindrance apply themselves to agriculture. The day celebrated by the veneration of the sun should not be devoted to the swearing and counter-swearing of litigant and their ceaseless brawling. That's why Christians go to church on Sunday. It's the day of the sun for the sun god. Because Emperor Constantine decreed that this is the day you will go to church. This is the Christian Sabbath. 1,700 years later, Christians are still going to church on Sunday. Another thing, Sol, the Roman sun god, he was born on 25 December. That's why Christians celebrate the birth of Jesus on 25 December. Because in the Bible, you could not become a rabbi until you turned 30, which is when Christ became a rabbi. Then Christ, he preached for 3.5 years before he was crucified. He was crucified in April. That's why we always celebrate Easter in April. You back up 6 months, Christ was born in September or October, depending on how it fell on the calendar. He was not born 25 December, but we celebrate Christ's birthday on 25 December because that's when the Roman sun god was born. And Emperor Constantine was drawing parallels between Roman paganism and Christianity. 1,700 years later, we're still celebrating Christ's birthday on 25 December. And there were so many parallels between the Roman sun god and Christianity that many pagans legitimately thought that the Christians worshiped the sun. Because another thing that the Christians did is they prayed facing east because Jerusalem was to the east. I mean, Christians no longer now do that, but back then they always prayed facing Jerusalem. And the sun rises in the east. So there's another parallel there that the Roman pagans legitimately thought that the Christians worshiped the sun. And 100 years after Emperor Constantine, Pope Leo I the Great, he's the Pope from 440 AD to 461 AD, did not like this because they had a really big problem because a lot of Christians, they'd go pray to the sun, conduct a pagan ritual, then they'd walk into St. Peter's Basilica, and then they'd pray to Christ. Pope Leo was like, no, we need to knock this off. Stop worshiping the sun. We worship Christ, not the sun. So in early Christian history, that was actually an enormous problem that they had back then. But that's how Emperor Constantine began incrementally getting Christianity into the Roman Empire. So, but here's the thing. By the time Emperor Constantine became Christian, Christianity was already around for close to 300 years. So on one hand, he has to appease the pagans, that way they don't overthrow him. But now he has to begin getting the Christians to accept his doctrine. Because the Edict of Milan in 313 AD, it made it easier to be Christian and granted some reparations to the Christians. So church lands were not subject to tax. They commanded the provinces to supply labor and materials for the construction of churches. because what Emperor Constantine wanted to do is he wanted to use Christianity to unite the empire because they're having those massive civil wars. So he thought that, hey, Christianity is a religion of peace. We can use this to bring peace to the Roman Empire and bring unity to it. So what he wanted to do is he wanted to create a church where everyone could belong to and everyone believes the same doctrine. And to do this, he began vastly increasing the church and worldly affairs. However, as I said, Christianity was around for close to 300 years because Christ was crucified in year 33 AD. Constantine did not become Christian until year 312 AD. So one of the major Christian factions that were around were the Donatists. They were a very powerful Christian faction in North Africa. This faction got going when the pagans demanded that the Christians sacrifice to pagan gods and give up their holy text. Notice, I did not say the Bible because the New Testament was not compiled at this point. Because what the Christians had going at this point was that they had individual letters floating around. Not all the letters made it into the Bible. That came in later. So I'm saying a holy text because the New Testament wasn't compiled. So back to the Donatists a little bit. The Donatists, they were very fierce and uncompromising enemies for those Christians who gave in to the pagans. So when Emperor Constantine, when he's drawing parallels between the pagans and the Christians, they were very strongly opposed to what he was doing. Like, hey, you're defiling Christianity. You can't say stuff like that. So the Donatists, even though they're Christian, they rejected the authority of Constantine's official church that he was creating. But because they're rejecting the emperor, the Roman Empire viewed them as staying in disharmony. And the disputes between the Donatists and Emperor Constantine's faction, they're becoming so strong that in year 316 AD, there began to be bloodshed occurring between the Christian sects. Now, 5 years later, Constantine reversed his decisions, but however, Christian blood still spilled Christian blood. And this is the first time that it happened on a large scale. Here's the second faction that was in the Roman Empire. It's called Arianism. They maintain that Jesus, the Son, is different than God the Father. They believe that Jesus was only a prophet, not the Son of God, and that he was less than divine. I mean, nowadays, Christians are, you're basically required to believe that, accept that Jesus is the Son of God. And if you do not accept that he is also divine, in addition to being a prophet, you effectively burden hell for eternity. And nearly every Christian denomination believes this. However, early on in the Roman Empire, many Christians did not believe this. They believed that Jesus was less than divine. Emperor Constantine handled this by excommunicating their leader Arius in year 323 AD. However, 12 years later, he was readmitted to the church by the Council of Jerusalem. Now, just a little bit of irony for you, because Emperor Constantine had his son, Constantine II, and Constantine II embraced Arianism. So while Constantine, who brought the Christianity to the Roman Empire, rejected that Jesus was less than divine, his son, Constantine II, embraced that Jesus was less than divine. So that's a little bit of irony for you. And so here's how Emperor Constantine initially attempted to unite the various Christian factions in Rome. In year 323 AD, he basically told them to shut up and become united. I'm the emperor. Here's my decree. You have to follow my decree. That didn't work out very well because ruling by authority and position does not always work. When you have to discuss something with somebody and persuade them to see your point, that is much more effective. So this didn't work. So what Emperor Constantine continued to do is he began issuing laws against heresies because he wanted to banish every religion and get everyone following the same doctrine to create unity in the Roman Empire. However, this didn't work out very well, and a year later, he began to reverse some of this, and he produced 6 public statements to explain why he became a Christian and his Christian purpose. Then he also began the Council of Nicaea in year 324 AD. And the whole purpose of this council was to bring all the Christian factions together. We discuss this, the Bible, and we create one doctrine that everyone belongs to, and that creates peace and unity in the Roman Empire. However, not all the Christian factions took place because it was mostly Eastern bishops, and this council lasted about 2 months. Now, there's a few things that came out of this council. One, that Constantine declared that Jesus is one with God, and they're one substance. Only 2 bishops refused, and they're both excommunicated after the council. So, as I said, right now in Christianity, we believe that Jesus the Father, God the Father, Jesus the Son, and the Holy Spirit, the Trinity, all three are one. That belief came out of the Council of Nicaea, and this came from the decree from Emperor Constantine. And last in my presentation, I went into the Trinity in the Baha'i faith, and since I went to it last week, I'm not going to be going into it again this week. And also in the Council of Nicaea, Emperor Constantine declared the decisions at the council were divinely inspired and mirrored the judgment of God. So this is when he began to push out his one Christian doctrine that everyone needs to belong to. And then he also held the second Council of Nicaea in year 327 AD. Now, here are also a few theological reforms that got into Christianity that really Christians really heavily stick with nowadays. Because Emperor Constantine, he was very afraid of God. He believed that God was quick to anger, because in the Roman Empire, they basically believed that the emperor mirrored God. And so Emperor Constantine, he was very quick to anger and judgment. So he believed that God was the same way. And so he was very, very afraid of God and believed that God was looking for a way to punish you. Because I know not every Christian denomination is like this, but the one I was brought up in, I always believed growing up that God he's angry. He's looking for an excuse to punish you. He wants to send you to hell for eternity. That's how I was always raised. So growing up, I always lived in a very strong state of fear of everything. I was always terrified of making a mistake because I thought that God was looking for an excuse to punish me. Again, not every Christian denomination like that is nowadays. I acknowledge that, but many are like that. And that really got going under Emperor Constantine, because that's how Constantine was. So he thought that God was like himself. Another thing, Emperor Constantine also believed in eternal punishment, because a lot of Christians, nearly every Christian denomination nowadays, believes that when you go to hell for eternity. You're there forever. You can't get out of it. The belief of eternal punishment came from Emperor Constantine, because that's what he believed. Another thing is he also believed in dualism: God versus the devil, good versus evil, right versus wrong, black and white. A very strong dualistic society, because many denominations believe right now that if you don't fall into this tiny box here that they believe, you're opposite with the devil and you're going to hell for eternity. That got in Emperor Constantine. So many of the things that we believe nowadays, that many Christians believe nowadays: eternal punishment, the dualism, the anger and wrath of God, the strong judgment from God, go to church on Sunday, celebrating Christ's birthday on the December 25th. A lot of this came in under Emperor Constantine when he began pushing this in the Roman Empire. And one thing Emperor Constantine did do is he also believed that having baptism at the end of his life. Because if he had baptism at the end of his life, then he believed that if he got baptized right before he died, God wouldn't forgive him many of his sins, because he knew as emperor, he's going to have to commit a lot of sins to stabilize the Roman Empire and get Christianity into there. And he believed that if he got baptized too early, he would not make it to heaven. So he waited till right before he passed away to be baptized. Also, here's a few other reforms that he put in. He abolished the crucifixion was abolished because Christ was crucified, and nobody should be die the same way Christ died. So you saw the abolition of crucifixion under Emperor Constantine. He also began setting standards for morality, because if you watch a lot of the old Roman movies, if you like a lot of old Roman artwork, they're very lewd and risque in a lot of it. This began to change. How do you dress in public? How do you act in public? Women having children without being married began to be frowned upon. Mistresses began to be frowned upon. So this is where a lot of standards for morality began to come in. And he also did not support the Jews in rebuilding the third temple, because under his reign, the Jews tried to rebuild their temple and he punished the Jews for it. So he did not support that. Now, let's get back to the Bible verse. That way we're all moving forward on the same page. The third angel sounded his trumpet, and a great star, blazing like a torch, fell from the sky on a third of the rivers and on the springs of water. And the name of the star is wormwood. A third of the waters turned bitter, and many people died from the waters that had become bitter. Now, the star coming down, that's Emperor Constantine, because Baha'u'llah tells us what the star symbolizes. Wormwood is something bitter, and many people died because of the water that became bitter. Yes, he got Christianity into the Roman Empire, but was very bitter in how he did it. Like, he spilled Christian blood. He attempted to create a single Christian doctor. He excommunicated those who disagreed with him. Yes, he he got Christianity into it, but it was bitter in how he did it. So that's why the Bible verse says that. So, reveal the trumpet blast, first trumpet blast, Christian persecution. Second trumpet blast, crisis of the 3rd century. Third trumpet blast is Emperor Constantine. Now, we're going to go over the fourth trumpet blast here, and then it'd be a great place to stop and take a break. Then we'll jump to the fifth trumpet blast. The fourth trumpet blast is only going to be a few slides. So it says, the fourth angel sounded his trumpet, and a third of the sun was struck, a third of the moon, and a third of the stars, so that a third of them turned dark. A third of the day was without light, and also a third of the night. As Baha'u'llah said, but I want to put this on here again. That way we're all on the same page. Thus, it had become evident that the sun, moon, and stars primarily signify the prophets of God, the saints, and their companions, those luminaries, the light of whose knowledge has shed illumination upon the worlds of the visible and invisible. So we see the sun and the moon and the stars being struck down and turning dark. So we're looking at like Christianity going into a decline here. And this came, remember, the Roman Empire was Christian by this point because Emperor Constantine brought Christianity to it. So what we're seeing here is the decline of West Rome, because that's why the sun, moon, and stars are turning dark, because you're seeing the Roman Empire declining. And a lot of the reason that the Roman Empire declined can be traced back to Emperor Constantine. Now, I'm not going to go into great detail over like the Roman administration, but I want to just give everyone just a general overview. That way they have a basic understanding of what happened. A few things Emperor Constantine did is he moved the capital from Rome to Byzantium, which is future Constantinople, which is modern-day Istanbul. So the capital of the Roman Empire wasn't even Rome anymore. Many of the tax reforms that he put in place led to the destruction of the Roman middle class, because the Romans, they had their local taxes, and then they had their national taxes. But one thing Emperor Constantine did is he began putting in the indirect tax, so it really heavily increased the taxes for the Roman middle class. And that really led to a lot of the destruction of them. Plus, another thing he did is he established an effective minting system, preventing the West from falling into a barter economy. So that's why even nowadays we still use cash. That's Emperor Constantine prevented the West from falling into barter. He kept the cash system going. Another thing Constantine did that really led to the decline is he basically began creating laws that you could not leave the farm that you were born in. So what happened is a lot of small farms, since they couldn't expand and go anywhere, this really led to the destruction of all the small farms, and a lot of them were replaced with serf and slave labor. So this really benefited the wealthiest 1%. So you have the middle class being decimated through taxes, and you have this lower class, they really couldn't expand anywhere. So this really began to lead to the decline of the Roman Empire. Another thing is, if you remember back, there were 4 emperors, 2 Caesars and 2 Augustuses. He reinstated the Roman Tetrarchy. He divided the Roman Empire amongst his 4 sons, so that was reinstated. Now here's another thing that happened. This is really what widely believed that this is really what led to the decline of West Rome. The reforms he made to the Roman Empire, because if you remember from the video I showed you, they were constantly having the barbarian tribes coming in and ransacking Rome. So what Emperor Constantine wanted to do is he wanted to create a smaller frontline force with an advanced rear guard, and that way any large-scale incursions into the Roman Empire could be quickly met by the advanced rear guard. And they would push the Roman tribes back. Well, that looks really good on paper, but it's absolutely terrible in practical. Because what happened was the Roman military at that point could not effectively respond to the barbarian incursions because they became very fat and lazy and very combat ineffective. Plus a lot of the Roman military, they had a lot of German barbarians in the military who didn't even want to fight their siblings. So this really led to a very strong decline in the Roman military, and this is widely believed. And so a lot of historians believe this is what led to the decline of West Rome. And now, I'm going to show a brief video. It takes you from 73 BC, from the start of the city of Rome, to the decline of West Rome, because 476 AD is widely believed when historians recognize that West Rome no longer existed. So we're going to watch this. It's going to take you from basically the start of the city of Rome to the fall of West Rome. That way everyone can get a visualization. All right, so 476 AD is widely when historians agree that West Rome no longer existed. So then you had East Rome here, which was the future Byzantine Empire, continued for another 1,000 years. So just to recap, Trumpet Blast 1, Christian persecution. The second, crisis of the 3rd century. The third is Emperor Constantine bringing Christianity to the Roman Empire. The fourth is the fall of West Rome. So if you want to take a break, this is an excellent time to take a break. And this is where we get to the first Trumpet Blast and the first War of Revelation. And this is when we begin to get into Islamic history. So the 3 woes. Because in the book of Revelation, we have 3 woes that the Bible talks about. It says in Revelation 9, the first woe is past, 2 other woes are yet to come. In Revelation 11, it says, the second woe is past, the third woe is coming soon. In the Baha'i faith, Abdul-Baha, remember, he's the Paul equivalent. He says that the 3 woes are the coming of the 3 prophets of God. Now, I did alter that quote, because if you look it up, what Abdul-Baha said, he gave a lot of detail for each quote, for each woe. So it was about a full paragraph that he went into, rather than just throw all the information at everyone at once. I'm just going with the 3 prophets of God. But that is a quote that I personally altered, and he goes into a lot more detail. So that sentence is not a direct quote. Then he goes on to say, woe is for the neglectful, woe is for the sinners, woe is for the ignorant. Now, let's recap from last week with Isaac and Ishmael. And then God said, yes, but your wife Sarah will bear you a son, and you will call him Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his descendants after him. And as for Ishmael, I have heard you. I will surely bless him. I will make him fruitful and will greatly increase his numbers. He will be the father of 12 rulers, and I'll make him into a great nation. But my covenant I will establish with Isaac, whom Sarah will bear to you by this time next year. When he had finished speaking with Abraham, God went up from him. The covenant was established with Isaac, and that's where Christ came from, and that's when he died on the cross for the redemption of our sins. But Ishmael was also promised 12 rulers and a great nation. He says, he will be the father of 12 rulers and will make him into a great nation. This is where Islam begins to come into. Then this is also repeated with Hagar and Ishmael. The matter distressed Abraham greatly because it concerned his son. But God said to him, do not be so distressed about the boy and your slave woman. Listen to whatever Sarah tells you, because it is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned. I will make the son of the slave into a nation also, because he is your offspring. Again, we were reckoned through the crucifixion of Christ because he died for our sins. That came through Isaac. I will make the son of the slave into a nation. And this is where Islam begins to come into. It says in Genesis 21, God heard the boy crying, and the angel of God called to Hagar from heaven and said to her, what is the matter, Hagar? Do not be afraid. God has heard the boy crying as he lies there. Lift the boy up and take him by the hand, for I will make him into a great nation. Again, 3 promises here for a great nation. So why is Islam referred to as nation here and not as a religion? We got a few reasons here. Because historians recognize that the first constitution ever written was the Constitution of Medina, and that was written during the time of Muhammad. Because what he started doing is he built the Constitution of Medina that gave all the Arab and Jewish tribes in the Arabian Peninsula duties and responsibilities, and began coalescing the Arabs into a nation. Then Islam also has a political aspect to it, because in Christianity, Jesus he had nothing to do with politics. He was the son of God and a prophet. So, but he never got involved in politics. So Christianity does not have a political aspect to it. Judaism, you can argue Judaism had a political aspect to it, because Moses, he was raised as a prince of Egypt. He delivered the Israelites from Egypt. So you can argue that Judaism has a political aspect to it, but nothing near on the same scale that Islam has to it. Another thing, when Islam expanded, they expanded within their borders, because after Muhammad passed away, Islam sent their armies out and they expanded as a nation through their armies. Another thing, Islam, they also adopted a new calendar, because in Islam, the calendar starts when Muhammad fled from Mecca to Medina. Mecca is about right here on the map, and Medina is a little to the north, about right here on the map. So that's is the Hijra in Arabic, or the flight. So 0 after Hijra, that's when the Islamic calendar starts, is year 622 AD, because the calendar we use in the West is the Christian calendar, and that starts with the birth of Christ. Islamic calendar starts when Muhammad, when he fled from Mecca to Medina. That was their hijrah, or their flight. And the Islamic calendar is not based off of solar, it's based off of lunar. So it only has 354 days in it. It does not have 365 days in it. And also, many Islamic organizations nowadays, they identify themselves as a nation or an empire. I mean, just to give you one case example, the organization called the Nation of Islam. Again, they call themselves a nation. So this is why the Bible makes 3 references to Ishmael as a nation. Now, here's where the 12 rulers come in. Because after Muhammad passed away, you had a dispute among in Islam. One group said that it should be the ruling council that elects the next leader. Those are the Sunnis. That map you saw in the previous slide that stretched from India all the way to Spain, that was all under the rule of one caliphate, and they're known as the Sunnis. Another group wanted it to stay in the bloodline, and they wanted to follow Ali. And those are and they became known as the Shiites. And there are 12 Shi'ite Imams. And so this is where the 12 rulers and the great nation that Ishmael is promised. The 12 Shi'ite Imams are the 12 rulers. The Sunni Caliphate is the great nation. And that's the 12 rulers and the great nation that Ishmael is promised. It's right here. And this coincides with the first coming of the prophet of God. And this is the 5th trumpet blast right here. Now, in part 1, we went over the first 4 trumpet blasts. They were 3 of them were only 1 verse, another trumpet blast is 2 verses. This is going to be 2 full paragraphs here. So how I'm going to do this is we're going to read 1 paragraph, then we'll do a verse by verse breakdown, and then I'll read a 2nd paragraph, and then I'll do a verse by verse breakdown, and then that will be my part 2 of this presentation. So Revelation 9, verses 1 through 6. The 5th angel sounded his trumpet, and I saw a star that had fallen from the sky to the earth. The star was given the key to the shaft of the abyss. When he opened the abyss, smoke rose from it like the smoke from a gigantic furnace. The sun and sky were darkened by the smoke from the abyss. Out of the smoke, locusts came down upon the earth and were given power like that of scorpions of the earth. They were told not to harm the grass of the earth or any plant or tree, but only those who did not have the seal of God on their foreheads. They were not given power to kill them, but only to torture them for 5 months. And the agony they suffered was like that of the sting of a scorpion when it strikes a man. During those days, men will seek death, but will not find it. They will long to die, but death will elude them. So let's start off with Revelation chapter 9. The 5th angel sounded his trumpet, and I saw a star that had fallen from the sky to the earth. The star was given the key to the shaft of the abyss. And, as Baha'u'llah said, thus it has become evident that the sun, moon, and stars primarily signify the prophets of God, the saints, and their companions, and those luminaries, the light of whose knowledge has shed illumination upon the worlds of the visible and invisible. So here, I saw a star that has fallen from the sky to the earth. So we are seeing someone of God coming in. Like the star, last star we saw symbolized Emperor Constantine bringing Christianity to the Roman Empire. Here, we're seeing a star coming in, opening a key to the shaft of the abyss. So we're seeing someone of God coming out. It says, when he opened the abyss, smoke from it like the smoke from a gigantic furnace. The sun and sky were darkened by the smoke from the abyss, as Baha'u'llah says in the Book of Certitude. By the terms sun and moon mentioned in the writings of the prophets of God is not meant solely the sun and moon of the visible universe. Nay, rather manifold are the meanings that have intended for these terms. In every instance, they have attached to them a particular significance. Thus, by the sun, in one sense, is meant those sons of truth who rise of the day spring of the ancient glory and fill the world with liberal effusion of grace from on high. So it says the sun and sky were darkened right here. So we're seeing like Christianity is beginning to be darkened, because when we saw last part, we saw the decline of West Rome. So that's when Christianity began to be darkened. Now we're seeing something of God coming in and overtaking it. And the Islamic empires, they were basically the supreme powers for the next 1,000 years, because there for the longest time, Islam eclipsed Christianity in height and power. It really wasn't until the 1600s and really up until the 1800s, that Christianity began to eclipse Islam. And this is what we have seen here. The sun and sky are being darkened. That's Christianity being eclipsed by Islam. And as I said, Islamic empires were the supreme powers for the next 1,000 years. Says the next verse, and out of the smoke, locusts came down upon the earth and were given power like that of scorpions of the earth. And this would have been a map of the Middle East during the time of Muhammad, because here you have the Arabian Peninsula, and here you have East Rome or the Byzantine Empire, and here you have Persia or the Sassanid Empire. Basically, what happened was the Persians and the Byzantians, they basically had an enormous war with each other right before Islam came in, and they severely weakened themselves. So Muhammad united the Arab tribes in the Arabian Peninsula. The Islamic armies advanced, and they were basically unstoppable for a long time. Because Muhammad, he fought 65 battles in a 10-year period, which averages out to be 55 battles. Averaging a battle every 55 days. So there was a lot of warfare during the time of Muhammad. And when the Islamic armies left the Arabian Peninsula, they conquered everything from India all the way over to Spain. That's what this verse is referring to right here. They were told not to harm the grass out of the earth or any plant or tree, but only those who did not have the seal of God on their foreheads. But to recap from last part, the righteous shall flourish like a palm tree, they will grow like a cedar of Lebanon. Again, the plant and trees symbolize something that is righteous. It says in Revelation 22, down the middle of the great street of the earth on each side of the river stood the tree of life bearing 12 crops of fruit, yielding its fruit every month. And the leaves of the tree are for the healing of nations. Again, but they were told not to harm the plant or tree, but only those who did not have the seal of God on their forehead. They were told not to harm, do not harm the Christians or the Jews, or there's another religion during this time called the Sabians, which has since died out. Islam has something called people of the book, which acknowledges the Jews, the Christians, the Sabians. They were told not to harm them. Now, I'm not going to say they followed it, because there's certainly many cases where they didn't follow it, but they were told not to. It says in Revelation 9, they were not given power to kill them, but only to torture them for 5 months. And again, we see the 5 months a few verses later. They had tails and sting like scorpions, and in their tails, they had power to torment people for 5 months. So remember, 1 day is equivalent to 1 year. So 1 week is 7 years. 1 month is 30 years. So 5 months is 150 years. And this is what we see here from 0 after Hijrah to 150 after Hijrah, which is also 622 AD to 768 AD. Islam was just unstoppable. They expanded from India all the way to Spain. And I'm going to play a video here so everybody can see just how unstoppable they were for the first 150 years. All right, so you see there just how Islam, they were unstoppable for the first 150 years, which is when they reached the height of their power. That's what that verse is referring to right there. And it says in Revelation 9, and the agony they suffered was like that of the sting of a scorpion when it strikes a man. During those days, men will seek death, but will not find it. They will long to die, but death will elude them. Because Islam was just so sick, their armies were just so unstoppable for so long. Many Christians thought that they were going to be praying to Mecca and Islam was going to overtake Europe. Because in the Western Europe, they got into within 100 miles of Paris. That's how far the Islamic armies pushed into. Then centuries later, on the east, the Islamic armies made it up into Austria to the city of Vienna and along the modern-day Polish border. So there were many in Europe who legitimately thought that Islam was getting ready to overrun Europe. And again, they were even making it up into Italy, and they actually made it to the gates of Rome at one point, but the Pope bribed the Islamic armies to leave. So many people in Europe thought that Islam was about ready to overtake them. So what Europe began to do is they had Christianity in common with each other. And so that's when the Pope began using Christianity and the Crusades as a way to unite the warring factions of Europe against Islam. That way Islam could not overtake Europe. So that's the history behind what happened there. So coming down to the second paragraph. The locusts looked like horses prepared for battle. On their heads, they wore something like crowns of gold, and their faces resembled human faces. The hair was like women's hair. Their teeth were like lions' teeth. They had breastplates like breastplates of iron, and the sound of their wings was like the thundering of many horses and chariots rushing into battle. They had tails and the stings like scorpions. In their tails, they had the power to torment people for 5 months. They had as king over them the angel of the abyss, whose name in Hebrew is Abaddon and in Greek, Apollyon. So, it's a verse-by-verse breakdown. Locusts looked like horses prepared for battle. On their heads, they wore something like crowns of gold, and their faces resembled human faces. Now, in biblical prophecy, here's what gold symbolizes, Revelation 14. And I looked, and behold, a white cloud. Upon the cloud, one sat like unto the Son of Man, having on his head a golden crown, and in his hand a sharp sickle. So, something gold in the Bible symbolizes something righteous, something of God. It's like heaven is paved with streets of gold. That's what that symbolism for. So when it says here, on their faces, they wore something like crowns of gold. Because the first woe is the coming of the prophet of God, which is Islam. It was like it was godly, but it wasn't. Because what we're going to get into for the next presentation, next week, is the Umayyad Caliphate defiled Islam. So it was like it was something of gold, but it's not. Instead, it resembled something human faces. And something human symbolizes something lustful, something sinful, something not of God. So they took something of God and they defiled it so it wasn't. That's what that verse says right there. Goes on to say, their hair was like women's hair and their teeth were like lions' teeth. They had breastplates like breastplates of iron, and the sound of their wings was like the thundering of many horses and chariots rushing into battle. Because when you have armor, it tells you what this symbolizes in the book of Ephesians, chapter 6, verse 14. Stand firm then with the belt of truth buckled around your waist with the breastplate of righteousness. So they had breastplates of iron. So this is something of God, something righteous that they had. And they were a religious army going forward. And the iron, what the iron symbolizes, it says in Daniel chapter 2, verse 40. Finally, there will be fourth kingdom, strong as iron, and as iron breaks and smashes everything, and as iron breaks things to pieces, so will it crush and break all other things. So what you have here is you have the armies of God, which is Islam, going forward and just annihilating everyone in their path, which is exactly what happened. I showed you that video, what happened for those 150 years. That's what that's referring to. You got their armies going forward. It says they had tails and stings like scorpions, and in their tails, they had the power to torment people for 5 months. We have already gone over that. I'm not going to go over that again. They had as king over them the angel of the abyss, whose name in Hebrew is Abaddon and in Greek Apollyon. The first woe is past, the other two woes are yet to come. They had king over, because Islam, they had their caliphate. That's who they had king over them. So especially soon after Prophet Muhammad, when they sent their armies out, they had one caliphate ruling from India all the way to Spain. One caliphate, one ruling, and that was the person that king over them, and that translates as destroyer. And we'll get into exactly why it translates as destroyer, and that's going to be in the next presentation, which I will link in the video. And these were the 5 major Islamic caliphates. You had the Rashidun Caliphate, which immediately followed the death of Muhammad, the Umayyad Caliphate, which defiled Islam. You had the Abbasid Caliphate, which is known as the Golden Era of Islam. You had the Almohad, which was won over Spain, and you had the Ottoman Caliphate, which fell shortly after World War I. So it fell not even 100 years ago. So this is actually very recent in world history. As I said, Abadan and Apollyon translate as destroyer. And so I want to show you just exactly how much warfare took place during this time. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to show you just kind of exactly how the fighting between the Christians and Muslims in Spain, and this war just went on for 800 years. And so this is what we're going to be concluding with. So I just want again, I want to get a visualization for everybody. All right, so that war between the Christian Spain and Islamic Spain went on for 800 years. And it finally ended in 1492. And remember, in 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue because they could fund Columbus sailing to America because they were no longer fighting those wars with Islam. And this is basically when American history begins. So recap, 5 trumpet blasts. First trumpet blast is Christian persecution. Second trumpet blast is the crisis of the 3rd century. The third trumpet blast is Emperor Constantine bringing Christianity to the Roman Empire. The fourth is the fall of West Rome. And the 5th trumpet blast and the first woe is the coming of Islam. And thank you for sitting through my presentation. Next week, I'm going to be going over the Beast of Revelation in Daniel, which is the Umayyad Caliphate. And then I'm going to go over who the 2 witnesses are. And then we'll be getting in the Baha'i history, which is the return of Elijah. So thank you for staying in this presentation and hope to see you next week.